My name is Liz DeVivo, and I live in upstate New York, in Binghamton, New York. I first started having changes to my body in 1996 when I was pregnant with my second child. And the changes came kind of slowly, and they noticed that I had an elevated anti-nuclear antibody level, an ANA level, and they thought that would go away after I had my baby. After I had my baby, it did not go away, and then other changes started to happen. I started to have Raynaud's phenomenon, and I started to have changes to my hands and face where my skin started to harden and to thin and to kind of become shinier. And my hands were swelling and my joints started to get arthritic and stuff. So those were the first changes I noticed. And then it probably took about 2 years before they were able to diagnose it as scleroderma, which is an autoimmune disease, much like lupus or MS or those types of more familiar autoimmune diseases. Scleroderma actually means hardening of skin. And what happens is your body overproduces collagen. And it can happen to your skin outside of your body, and it can happen inside your body to your organs. And so when I was first diagnosed, it was really looking like it was mostly skin involved outside. And so I didn't really pay much attention to it. I felt okay. I had some fatigue, but I was okay. I had 2 little kids. I was going to college. I felt okay. I was tired. I just assumed that it was because I was a full-time grad student and taking care of 2 kids that I was exhausted and kind of out of shape. I found myself getting harder and harder, like getting more and more out of breath. And I really chalked it up to like inertia and lack of doing things. So I did like 2 weeks of exercise and realized that I wasn't getting any exercise tolerance. I knew I was actually getting worse. And I knew I was in a bit of trouble then, that something was going on. And so I ended up going to the hospital or to the doctor, and my blood pressure was really high. They decided to send me to the hospital. And when they did send me to the hospital, I had a pericardial effusion, which is fluid around your heart that builds up around in the sac of your heart. That was like the first thing that happened that kind of threw me into crisis mode. And I knew I wasn't well and something was wrong. And so after that, they really thought that was a scleroderma-based kind of event, and they thought I would heal and go on. But I just didn't heal, and I couldn't get my breath back, and I was really struggling with walking even, just a few yards or a few feet, and it was really hard. And I kept thinking I would go back to work and that I would get better and I would go back to work and I would be fine. And it just wouldn't turn around, and it wouldn't turn around. And finally, they sent me to a cardiologist. And when I went to the cardiologist, he said, "I'm sorry, you have pulmonary hypertension. Do you know what that is?" And I did know, because I knew that was a complication for some people with scleroderma. And he just looked at me and he said, I'm sorry. And I said, "Well, what's my prognosis?" And he said, "Maybe 2 to 5 years." And that was literally the end of the discussion. That was all the discussion there was at the time. And that was the year 2000. I was devastated after talking to him. I was angry after talking to him. I was sad after talking to him. But mostly I was just determined as, to figure out something. I just couldn't believe that was just it, really. And so the first thing I did was go to New York City and find a pulmonary hypertension specialist in New York. And at that time, there was very limited help. There was very limited help on the computer. There weren't very many support groups. There was very limited stuff going on. You could find a tiny bit, but not much. And so I went to New York hoping someone could give me some kind of hope. I met with a pulmonary hypertension specialist there, and, he did all the preliminary stuff and the cath and the echoes and everything that goes along with that. And basically my pulmonary pressures were really high, and I was a pretty good wreck. I think it was in the 120s when I was first diagnosed, and I could barely walk, and I was blue. My lips were blue, my fingers were blue, my feet were blue. I was pretty blue. And so that was in July of 2000, and by September of 2000, I was put on IV medication. And they thought that perhaps they could add something to stop the fibrosis or the hardening of my lungs. So I also did 6 months of chemo therapy to help stop the hardening of my lungs. And all through that time, I still had the pericardial effusions. And so my heart kept filling up, and I kept having to have get to the point of almost tamponade, cardiac tamponade, and they would drain it. And after the third time it happened, they finally decided to just open up my pericardial sac and leave it open, which was helpful. So that was definitely helpful. That first year that I was diagnosed was really hard. I was hospitalized over and over and over. It was like plugging a dike. Like every time you'd plug the dike, it would spring a leak somewhere else. Something else would go wrong. And so I knew I was running out of time fast. The writing was on the wall, pretty clear, I think. And so I knew I needed to start looking for other solutions. So at that point, I signed up to any experiments I could. And at that time, they were experimenting with oral meds. So I was open to any kind of trials or experiments that there were available to me at that time. So I signed up for some oral meds. And it started with that. At that point, I knew I needed something else, more help for sure. And I started looking for a transplant. Nobody, actually, none of my doctors, I don't think at that time, really even suggested it. I just started asking. And I think mostly they signed me up and made the appointment for me kind of just to placate me, I think, at that time. I went to a hospital in New York and met with the surgeon there, and he promptly turned me down right there on the spot, right to my face, and told me I was too sick and I was a waste of resources, how he put it. He didn't think I could survive the illness, and because it was scleroderma, and scleroderma is not even curable with a transplant, they couldn't justify the use. So I was pretty devastated, completely devastated, but very determined still. And I had a lot of support from my family and friends. And we just set about calling and finding out what centers in the U.S. would even consider me. And at that time, there was only like 3 places that would consider me, in Texas and in California and in Pittsburgh. So because Pittsburgh is the closest, I started with them. And I called them and made the appointment thinking, maybe I needed a lung or 2. And they said, no, you need a heart and 2 lungs. And I knew that was just going to be a harder surgery physically and a harder surgery to wait for. I mean, those are very rare surgeries with very few people on the list. I knew my chances were diminishing fast. And at the time, I was only about 95 pounds. And so I knew I was waiting for a very small donor, because you can put big organs in a big body or small organs in a big body, but you can't put big organs in a small body. So I was waiting for a small person, and I was a B negative blood type, which is pretty rare. And so I knew that my odds were not really very good at all. I waited 15 months before I got my first call for a transplant. It was actually, I was in New York City for an educational forum on scleroderma, and it was November, and who would figure, but it was actually snowy and icy and windy, and I couldn't get a plane to fly me to Pittsburgh, so I had to turn down the organs, which was horrible. But I had to believe that they were for someone else. They just had to be for someone else. And then I continued my wait, and at 23 months, I finally got the call, the real deal call. It was in July 29th of 2003, and it was a beautiful sunny day, and I went to Pittsburgh, and I was not even afraid at that point, because I knew it was my only chance to live. My surgery itself went, I think, pretty well. It was pretty standard, I think, about maybe 8 hours. He came out and told my family that everything went well, and now they were just going to work on closing me up, and he would be out in a few hours to let them know. And I guess the few hours turned into many hours and turned into more hours. And I had some problems with bleeding, and they couldn't stop my heart from bleeding, and they couldn't get my heart in sync either. I have what's called a clamshell incision, which goes from my armpit to my armpit, and they literally work on me like that, like open. This part is really hard for me to really even fathom or understand. So they worked on me for like a week while I was open like that, which is just crazy to even imagine. I don't get it. And I was in a medically induced coma for at least a few weeks, if not more, before I was conscious. And even when I was conscious, I was just not, I had no idea what was going on. I was hallucinating like crazy, and I was in ICU for like 7 weeks. I just had a really hard time. Finally, when I got out of surgery and when I got out of ICU, probably took another couple months or so before I actually made it home. I had my transplant in July, and I got home the day before Thanksgiving. It was a pretty long road. It was not easy. And even at that point, I still didn't even know I was better. Everyone would say, Liz, you're pink. Your lips are pink. You look good. And I couldn't even tell I was better. And it took like 6 months after my surgery, and we were walking. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I think that wasn't so hard. And it was like the light bulb went off in my head, and I couldn't even believe it. I think I'm better. And then from that moment on, like the joy just started rushing in. And then I just started to heal faster and faster and feel better and be better. And it was a pretty amazing journey for sure. And then I think it took about a whole year to really recoup from that surgery for sure. Well, my kids were pretty little at that point. They were 7 and 10. So I was pretty happy to be their mother and to take care of them and to take care of my family, and honored to do those things. My kids graduated from high school. I returned to work part-time as a social worker, and I worked in dialysis for about 4 or 5 years doing that, which was wonderful. I spend my time volunteering for Donate Life events and educating the public about organ donation. And I also spend time talking to medical health professionals. I spend a lot of time talking to nurses, new hires, and fellows and interns when they'll have me. And I think the most important thing health professionals can give us is hope. That's like the most important asset, as far as I'm concerned, that anybody can give somebody who's suffering from a chronic illness is hope. I think for the most part, the medical professionals really are trained to give you the hard, cold facts. And those hard, cold facts are ugly numbers that don't represent everything. You know, when you're facing terrible statistics, like every time that they say, oh, there's an 80% chance or 90% chance, it's really important to always point out that there's 20% of people that can do this, or 10% that can survive. It's important to focus on the people that do survive and can survive and are surviving. That's my point that I always bring home to doctors, and especially because they're so focused on research, especially the younger ones. I really try to point out that all the medical data does not point out all the information out there, for sure. The more years they spend in the medical arena, the more they'll see the people that break the rules, the people that they don't understand, the cases that defy the odds. And it's important to share that information and that hope with their patients. And that's why it's important to share those stories. The biggest asset anyone has in their fight to any disease is their brain. And that's the bottom line. If you believe it can happen, if it's possible, if you believe it's possible, it can be possible. If you don't think it's possible because all the data says it's not possible, it'll never be possible. Well, I started writing a blog while I was sick, and it ended up becoming a book. My book is called Holding On for Dear Life: What My Fatal Illness Taught Me About Living. And it started because people kept saying, Liz, you need to make this book. I've learned so much from you. You really need to make this book. And it was more than just people, who are sick even. It was all kinds of people that were telling me that it had some importance to them in their life. And so I added more to the blog. So it's more than just a blog. And it became, health advice for people going through catastrophic illness. And it also became like a primer of some kind for healthcare professionals too. So it has some advice for healthcare professionals. It's almost like a how to survive your catastrophic illness book. And it talks about we're more than just our illness. We come to the table as patients, and we come with all our symptoms, but we also come with all our history and our family members and everything else that comes to the table. So we're more than just the symptoms that you add up in the column. It really is about hope and the importance of hope in the healing process. The medicines are changing every minute, every day, every year. It's amazing the strides that have taken place in the last 10 years, 15 years. It's mind-boggling. When I see the stories of people who are newly diagnosed, I'm grateful for them because I know it's so much better than it was. So my takeaway is to never forget that your hope and your brain, it's the greatest asset you have in fighting this disease. My name is Liz DeVivo, and I'm aware that I'm rare.